There is a deeply rooted belief in our society that crying easily, getting emotional frequently, or displaying intense feelings represents a character weakness. For decades, we have been taught to value emotional restraint as synonymous with maturity and strength. But what if everything we've been told about this is fundamentally wrong? What if the ability to feel deeply is not a flaw in the system, but rather a distinct neurological characteristic that has its own evolutionary and psychological advantages? Over the next few minutes, we will explore together the fascinating world of emotional sensitivity, unraveling the brain mechanisms that cause some people to experience emotions more intensely than others. We will challenge old prejudices and discover what modern neuroscience has to tell us about those who feel the world more profoundly. Before we continue, if you identify with this topic or know someone living this reality, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content. And in the comments, tell me, what time is it right now as you watch this video? Let's create a global community by sharing our different time zones. Now, let's begin our journey through the emotional brain by first understanding what really happens when someone gets emotional easily. For a long time, the most common answer we heard was simply that these people couldn't control their emotions. But contemporary science shows us a completely different story. It's not about lack of control, but rather a fundamentally different emotional processing that begins in deep structures of our brain. Inside each of us exists a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. This cluster of neurons, located in the limbic system, functions as a kind of emotional alarm center of the brain. The amygdala constantly processes stimuli we receive from the environment, evaluating whether they represent threats, opportunities, or emotionally significant experiences. In people who get emotional easily, neuroimaging studies have revealed something extraordinary. The amygdala tends to be more reactive and shows more intense activation when exposed to emotional stimuli. But this doesn't happen in isolation. The brain functions like a complex orchestra where different regions need to work in harmony. Researchers have discovered that in emotionally sensitive individuals, there is also a difference in how the prefrontal cortex communicates with the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is our most evolved brain region, responsible for rational thinking, planning, and emotional regulation. When the connection between these two areas functions differently, the result is not a failure, but simply distinct emotional processing. Imagine the brain is like a sound system. Some people are born with the volume adjusted to moderate levels, while others have this volume naturally higher. It doesn't mean the equipment is broken or that the person doesn't know how to use the controls. It's simply a different factory setting. And this configuration has its roots in both genetics and life experiences, especially those lived in the early years of development. Genetics plays a fascinating role in this story. There is a specific genetic variation related to serotonin transport that has caught the attention of neuroscientists. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter crucial for mood and emotion regulation. People who possess a particular version of this transporter gene tend to process negative emotions more intensely and show greater amygdala activity when exposed to stressful or emotionally charged situations. This is not a disease or disorder, it's simply a natural variation of human diversity, just like eye color or height. But the story doesn't end with genes. Childhood experiences profoundly shape how our brain processes emotions. Children who grow up in environments where emotions are validated and welcomed develop neural circuits that favor healthy expression of feelings. On the other hand, when emotions are not understood or accepted during development, this can add layers of shame and self-criticism that complicate that person's relationship with their own emotions throughout life. Here we arrive at a crucial point that needs to be clarified. Getting emotional easily is not synonymous with emotional instability or lack of emotional intelligence. In fact, many highly sensitive people develop exceptional emotional intelligence precisely because they experience emotions so vividly. They learn early on to navigate an ocean of feelings that others can barely perceive as a small wave. They develop refined empathy skills, can capture subtle nuances in facial expressions and body language of others, and frequently become excellent listeners and counselors. Psychologist Elaine Aron has dedicated decades of her career to studying what she calls highly sensitive people. Her research indicates that approximately 15 to 20% of the population possesses a more responsive nervous system, processing sensory and emotional information with greater depth. These people not only feel more intensely, but also reflect more deeply on their experiences. They notice details others don't see, are more affected by chaotic or noisy environments, and yes, get emotional more easily in the face of art, music, stories, and human experiences. What society frequently interprets as fragility may actually be a form of strength that simply hasn't been recognized or valued. Think of the great artists, writers, musicians, and poets who shaped our culture. Many of them were known for their intense emotional sensitivity. This ability to feel deeply didn't prevent them from creating masterpieces. On the contrary, it was precisely this emotional depth that allowed them to capture and express aspects of human experience that others couldn't reach. But living with this heightened sensitivity in a world that often values emotional toughness brings real challenges. One of the most common difficulties reported by emotionally sensitive people is the feeling of being constantly out of place or misunderstood. When you cry during an emotional commercial and everyone around remains unmoved, when you're deeply shaken by sad news while others continue with their lives normally, or when you need to withdraw from social environments because the level of stimulation is overloading your nervous system, it's easy to start believing there's something wrong with you. This dissonance between internal experience and external expectations can lead to a psychological phenomenon known as chronic emotional invalidation. When we repeatedly hear phrases like "stop being dramatic," "you're too sensitive," "that's no reason to cry," or "you need thicker skin," we internalize the message that our feelings are not legitimate or appropriate. Over time, this can result in a deep disconnection from our own emotions, or in the development of defense mechanisms that, while protecting against external judgment, also distance us from a fundamental part of who we are. Here enters an important distinction that needs to be made. Feeling emotions intensely doesn't mean being controlled by them. Some emotionally sensitive people develop exceptional emotional regulation skills precisely because they need to deal with a wider and more intense range of feelings. They learn sophisticated techniques to process and integrate their emotions without being completely overwhelmed by them. The difference lies in recognizing that the intensity of the initial emotional experience is not under conscious control, but the way we respond to that experience certainly is. Think of this as the difference between the weather and what we do in response to the weather. An emotionally sensitive person may experience more intense emotional storms, but that doesn't mean they can't learn to seek shelter, wait for the storm to pass, or even dance in the rain. The problem isn't the storm itself, but living in a society that insists you should be able to control the weather through sheer willpower. Neuroscience offers us fascinating insights into why some strategies work better than others for emotionally sensitive people. For example, emotional suppression, which is the act of actively trying to hide or repress emotions, not only doesn't work well for these people, but can be counterproductive. Studies show that trying to suppress intense emotions often results in a rebound effect, where the emotion returns even stronger later. Moreover, constant suppression is associated with elevated stress levels, memory problems, and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. On the other hand, strategies like cognitive reappraisal, where we change how we interpret an emotionally charged situation, and radical acceptance, where we allow emotions to exist without judgment, tend to work much better. For emotionally sensitive people, learning to surf the emotional waves instead of trying to build barriers against them generally leads to healthier and more sustainable results. There is also a fascinating evolutionary dimension to this discussion. Why would heightened emotional sensitivity persist in the human population if it were purely a disadvantage? Researchers propose that, from an evolutionary perspective, having more sensitive individuals in a group offered important advantages. These people would be the first to detect subtle changes in the environment, to perceive when something was wrong in the social group, to respond empathetically to the needs of children or vulnerable members of the community. In evolutionary terms, the diversity of temperaments is not an accident, it's a survival strategy. When we look at traditional societies and indigenous cultures around the world, we frequently find valued roles for people with heightened sensitivity. Healers, spiritual counselors, artists, and keepers of stories were often those who felt and perceived the world more deeply. These cultures recognized that different types of people brought different essential gifts to the community. It was only with industrialization and the valorization of productivity above all else that we began to see emotional sensitivity as a defect to be corrected. This leads us to reflect on the cultural and social impact on how we understand and value different emotional expressions. In some cultures, expressing emotions openly is seen as a sign of authenticity and deep human connection. In others, emotional restraint is considered an essential virtue. These cultural norms shape not only how others see us, but also how we see ourselves. An emotionally sensitive person born in a culture that values emotional expression may develop healthy self-esteem around their sensitivity, while the same person in a culture that values stoicism may grow up feeling fundamentally flawed. The role of gender in this discussion also cannot be ignored. Social gender expectations profoundly influence how we interpret and judge emotional expression. Historically, different standards have been applied to different groups, creating barriers for people of all genders to develop a healthy relationship with their own emotions. These harmful social norms not only invalidate legitimate emotional experiences but also impede the development of genuine emotional self-acceptance. Fortunately, we are witnessing a gradual shift in these perceptions. Increasingly, society is beginning to recognize that emotional health doesn't mean absence of emotions or the ability to keep them always under rigid control. Instead, emotional health involves the capacity to feel fully, process constructively, and express appropriately to the context. For emotionally sensitive people, this means finding environments, relationships, and practices that honor their particular way of experiencing the world. In the context of relationships, emotional sensitivity can be both a gift and a challenge. On one hand, emotionally sensitive people are often deeply empathetic partners, attentive to the emotional needs of others and capable of creating connections of great intimacy. On the other hand, they may feel hurts and conflicts especially intensely, need more time to process difficult emotional experiences, and benefit enormously from partners who understand and respect this need. Communication becomes fundamental. When an emotionally sensitive person can articulate their needs, explain that their intense reactions are not manipulation or dramatization but rather their genuine way of experiencing the world, and when the partner can listen without judgment and offer validation without trying to fix or minimize, the relationship can flourish in extraordinarily deep ways. Conversely, relationships where emotional sensitivity is constantly criticized or not understood can become significant sources of stress and suffering. In the professional environment, emotionally sensitive people also face unique challenges and opportunities. In highly competitive corporate cultures that emphasize intense assertiveness and suppression of vulnerability, these people may feel constantly out of place or forced to wear masks that consume precious energy. However, in environments that value creativity, collaboration, emotional intelligence, and human-centered innovation, the same characteristics can be tremendously valuable. Many emotionally sensitive people discover they thrive in careers related to caregiving, arts, counseling, teaching, or advocacy for social causes, where their ability to feel deeply and connect empathetically with others represents a clear advantage. Others develop strategies to create niches within larger organizations where they can contribute in ways that honor their strengths while establishing healthy boundaries to protect their emotional well-being. Establishing boundaries, incidentally, is a critical skill for emotionally sensitive people. Contrary to the myth that sensitivity equals fragility, establishing and maintaining firm boundaries requires a deep form of strength. It means recognizing your own needs and capacities, communicating them clearly to others, and being willing to say no even when it generates temporary discomfort. For someone who feels intensely the disappointment or disapproval of others, this can be especially challenging, but it is absolutely essential for long-term health. Self-care practices also take on particular dimensions for emotionally sensitive people. It's not just about basic physical self-care, although adequate sleep, nutrition, and exercise are certainly important. It's about creating a lifestyle that recognizes and respects specific emotional processing needs. This can include regular time in solitude to recharge after intense social interactions, Contemplative practices like meditation or expressive writing that help process emotional experiences, and conscious choice of the types of media and content consumed, since emotionally sensitive people can be more affected by certain stimuli. The relationship with nature often plays a special role in the lives of emotionally sensitive people. Many report that natural environments offer a unique form of emotional regulation and restoration. Science supports these observations, showing that exposure to nature reduces activity in the amygdala and promotes states of calm and well-being. For someone with a more reactive nervous system, the slower pace and less intense stimuli found in natural environments can provide profound relief from the constant overstimulation of modern life. When we talk about seeking professional help, it is valuable for emotionally sensitive people to find therapists who understand sensitivity as a natural temperament trait. A professional with this perspective can help the person develop effective emotional regulation strategies, work through past experiences, and build a life that honors who they really are, rather than trying to force them to fit into molds that don't align with their nature. Therapeutic approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion-focused therapy, and certain forms of psychodynamic therapy can be particularly helpful. These approaches emphasize acceptance of internal experiences, development of self-compassion, and connection with deep personal values, rather than focusing primarily on changing or controlling symptoms. For emotionally sensitive people who have spent years trying to mold themselves into something they're not, this permission to simply be can be profoundly liberating. It's also important to mention that, although emotional sensitivity itself is just a personality trait, when combined with life stressors, anyone can benefit from additional professional support. If you notice that the intensity of emotions is making it difficult to maintain your daily activities or relationships, talking with a qualified professional can offer valuable tools and useful perspectives for navigating these challenges. As we approach the end of this journey through the world of emotional sensitivity, it's worth reflecting on what it means to live authentically as a person who feels deeply in a world that doesn't always understand or value this way of being. Perhaps the question isn't how to become less sensitive, but rather how to create a life that allows this sensitivity to flourish as the gift it truly is. This might mean consciously choosing relationships with people who see your sensitivity as a strength, not a weakness. It might mean seeking work that aligns with your values and utilizes your natural empathetic capacities. It might mean developing a spiritual or creative practice that gives outlet to the depth of your feelings. It might mean establishing firm boundaries with those who repeatedly invalidate your emotional experiences. It might simply mean stopping apologizing for being who you are. The deepest transformation happens when we stop seeing our emotional sensitivity through the lens of pathology or deficiency and begin to recognize it as a particular form of intelligence, a unique way of being in the world that has its own value and beauty. When we stop trying to fix ourselves and start understanding ourselves, when we replace self-criticism with self-curiosity, when we exchange shame for acceptance, something remarkable happens. We don't become less sensitive, but we become more skilled at navigating this sensitivity, more confident in our own experience, more capable of establishing deep connections with others and with life itself. In the end, perhaps the most important question isn't why some people get emotional easily, but why we built a society that treats emotional depth as something to be corrected. What do we lose when we teach our children to harden their hearts? What kind of world could we create if, instead, we honored and protected their natural capacity to feel deeply, to genuinely care, to respond to the suffering of others with compassion instead of indifference? People who get emotional easily don't need curing. They need understanding, validation, and spaces where they can be fully who they are. They need a society that recognizes that different temperaments bring different gifts, and that emotional sensitivity, far from being a weakness, is one of the qualities that makes us profoundly human. It's what allows us to create art that moves hearts, build connections that sustain souls, and respond to the suffering of the world not with apathy, but with the courage to feel and the willingness to care. May we look at those who cry easily, who feel deeply, who get emotional with the beauty and sadness of existence, not with contempt or condescension, but with recognition that they carry a precious gift. A gift that reminds us that, despite all our technology and rationality, we are still creatures of feeling and connection. And in this capacity to feel, to get emotional, to be touched by the world, resides something sacred that should not be diminished, but celebrated. May every emotionally sensitive person watching this video know that there is nothing wrong with you. You are not too dramatic, too sensitive, or too emotional. You are exactly as the Lord God created you to be, with purpose and intention, and your sensitivity is not a flaw in the design, but an essential characteristic that makes you unique and valuable in this vast and complex world.